What can I say about the new God of War that hasn't already been said dozens of times? The game has seen more unanimous praise throughout the game review community than anything I can think of from recent history, and there's plenty of good reason for that. But unlike most, when the first gameplay footage was shown at E3 2016, I wasn't immediately sold on all the changes. For me, God of War represents a lot. The first two games will always be special to me, not just because they were excellent games, but because they reignited my interest in video games in general after a several-year hiatus where I basically just used my PS2 as a DVD and CD player. I'd like to think I would have gotten back into games eventually without the God of War games, but I'm honestly not sure. I was and am a legit die-hard God of War fan, and if there was anybody that was at risk of being pissed off by all of the changes with the new game, it was fans like me. I realize he wasn't for everybody, but I always enjoyed Kratos as a character. Was he two-dimensional? Yes. But I never thought that was necessarily a problem. Not every character in a video game has to be super complicated and have 15 different layers of emotional depth. Not every story has to have a wide spectrum of ups and downs, and not every cast of characters has to be perfectly well-rounded. So when the new game was being pitched as a more thoughtful story and a more cautious Kratos, I couldn't help but think, why? I never thought it would be bad, and I never questioned whether or not I would be buying the game on day one, as Santa Monica is easily one of my favorite developers, and has been for a long time, and I trust them, but all these changes seemed unnecessary to me. Santa Monica was definitely going for a high-risk, high-reward strategy here, and as a longtime God of War fan, I can absolutely say that it worked. Sony's Santa Monica pulled it off. The important thing is, the changes to the new game don't negate what God of War was, but rather just gracefully add to it. Yes, Kratos is more thoughtful and cautious, but he's also much older and wiser, so being more cautious and thoughtful makes sense for him at this point. Plus, his anger and rage is still absolutely a part of him, making the changes to his character feel more like a logical evolution than an external decision made by developers and forced into the franchise. Kratos' struggle with his rage as an older man serves as a perfect metaphor for Cory Barlog and his team's struggle to extend the story past the realm of Greek mythology in a way that makes sense and feels right, and thankfully both struggles prove to be worth having. God of War immediately reminds me of my favorite game of last year, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Both games are third-person, over-the-shoulder action. They both take place in an ancient Nordic setting, and very interestingly, they both feature a head on the main character's waistline. Pretty weird. We'll probably never know why these two games had these very specific things in common, but it's an interesting thing to take note of nevertheless.
What is that?
The only small side effect of the gameplay change for God of War that I noticed is that Kratos does feel slightly limited with no dedicated jump button anymore. And I couldn't help but ask myself, why the hell does Kratos, the same guy that killed Zeus with his bare hands, need an 11-year-old boy to drop a chain for him to climb a ledge that's 4 feet above his head? Not a big deal, obviously, as I suppose it's just a natural side effect of this style of game, but it does seem odd for his character and perhaps could have benefited from some sort of contextual explanation. Unlike the previous games, God of War 2018 is semi-open world, much like the modern Tomb Raider games are, possibly an idea that bled over into Cory's style after working on the 2013 Tomb Raider reboot. This new Norse world really works nicely for the game and gives you a lot of things to do if you want them, but also it shepherds you through the story nicely if you don't. The new characters are all immediately more memorable than most that I've seen in games and couldn't have been written or portrayed any better in my opinion. Atreus in particular is great, often testing Kratos' patience but also driving Kratos' internal progress. In gameplay, Atreus is not the tag-along burden that some, including myself, feared that he would be, but rather he acts as an arm of Kratos in combat, complete with his own upgradable elements and skill tree, which further deepens an already massive combat system. Mimir ended up being my favorite of the supporting cast and adds quite a lot to the dynamic between Kratos and his son once he is introduced.
Boy, the longer you wait to tell him his true nature, the more damage you do. He will resent you and you may lose him forever.
There is much about me I would not have him know.
So you value your privacy more than your son?
I'm going to cut off your head now.
Fair enough.
The Leviathan axe itself is awesome and quickly became one of my favorite video game weapons of all time. Using the axe never gets old, and it's totally a worthy successor to the blades of the previous games. Bare-handed combat is fun too, and sometimes I even preferred it. There's just so many ways to fight in God of War. The sheer amount of ways to take on enemies is one of the game's greatest strengths and re-solidifies Sony Santa Monica as the king of action-adventure combat, in my opinion. On top of having top-notch combat, God of War's presentation and graphics are outstanding and tower over anything else you're probably going to play on your PS4 this year or probably next year. On the PS4 Pro, you're really in for a treat as the favor resolution mode super samples the 4K picture for 1080p displays, providing a very sharp picture that stays at a rock-solid 30 frames per second throughout, while the favor performance mode unlocks the frame rate, which generally seems to sit somewhere between 50 and 60. The inconsistency of the frame rate in this mode might bother some people who are very sensitive to that, but I found this to be the superior mode as it generally stays quite smooth and I don't notice much of a difference at all in fidelity in either mode, so there is a case to be made for either one, and it really just comes down to your personal preference. The musical score is perhaps the best in the entire franchise, which is saying a lot since I absolutely loved the score from 2 and 3, and I still listen to some of the tracks from them from time to time, but the new score composed by Bear McCreary is a complete masterpiece, and deserves a listen by anybody like me who likes that kind of thing. It's amazing to think of how many things Sony Santa Monica Cory Barlog and his team have accomplished with this game. In one fell swoop, they've revived a franchise and rescued it from the mediocrity that Ascension threatened it with. They continued a storyline that seemed almost backed into a corner at the end of God of War 3, but now feels limitless in terms of where it can go for the future. And they've told an excellent coming-of-age story through the relationship with Kratos and his son. Above all of that though, and perhaps what resonated with me the most about the story, is that this is a story also about grappling with your past, being at peace with who you've become, and embracing your future. It's a timeless, important sentiment for a game to explore, and I can't recommend joining Kratos on his journey through it enough.